The truth of a city isn't in its glittering downtown skyline or its manicured parks. It's in the fluorescent, 2 a.m. glare of its public hospital emergency rooms. St. Jude's Metropolitan was a monument to that truth. It smelled of antiseptic, stale coffee, and a faint, metallic tang of blood that no amount of bleach could ever fully erase. The air, thick and recycled, carried a symphony of human misery. The rhythmic, anxious beeping of a cardiac monitor, the wet, ragged cough of a man in alcove 3, the strained murmur of a resident presenting a case, and underneath it all, the constant, low hum of machinery that kept people alive. This was Alara Vance's world. At 28, she had the eyes of someone a decade older and the reflexes of someone a decade younger. Her auburn hair, which might have been vibrant in the sunlight, was pulled back in a practical, slightly frayed bun that had been secured 12 hours ago and hadn't been thought of since. A faint, brown coffee stain bloomed on the sleeve of her navy blue scrubs like a badge of honor for surviving another double shift. She moved through the chaos not with the frantic energy of a rookie, but with the smooth, deliberate economy of a veteran. Every step had a purpose, every gesture a practiced efficiency. "Mr. Gable, I need you to breathe with me," she said, her voice a calm island in his sea of panic. The elderly man on the gurney was clutching his chest, his face pale and slick with sweat. His own breaths were shallow, panicked rasps. In and out. That's it. You're not having a heart attack. Your rhythm is just a little jumpy. We're going to get it sorted. She held his hand, her touch firm and reassuring, and watched the line on his monitor steady ever so slightly. She wasn't just treating a symptom, she was treating a person. 10 minutes later, with Mr. Gable resting more comfortably, she was at the side of a pale-faced college kid, dehydrated from a stomach bug, a fresh-faced resident, Dr. Taylor. Chen was fumbling with an IV needle, his brow furrowed in concentration. "You're angling too high, Chen," Ellie said quietly, without a hint of condescension. "You'll go right through the vein. Lower your angle to 15 degrees, and anchor the vein with your thumb, like this." She gently guided his hand. "Now, what's the standard saline drip rate for moderate dehydration in a patient his size?" Chen, relieved, answered correctly as the needle slid home. Ellie gave him a small nod of approval. She wasn't just a nurse. She was a teacher, a guardian of the institutional knowledge that kept this place running. The automatic doors hissed open, admitting a blast of damp night air and a wall of noise. A belligerent drunk, escorted by 2 weary police officers, was shouting obscenities. He wasn't injured, just intoxicated and angry. He took a clumsy swing at a security guard. Before the situation could escalate, Ellie stepped forward. "Sir," she said, her voice cutting through his drunken tirade. It wasn't loud, but it was firm. "We can get you some water and a place to sit down, but you have to lower your voice. You are frightening the other patients." She didn't threaten him. She simply stated a fact and offered a choice. The man, confused by the lack of aggression, blinked and allowed the officers to guide him to a chair. De-escalation was a tool, just like a syringe or a stethoscope. As she turned away, a sharp, nasal voice cut through the din. "Vance, my office, now." Head nurse Brenda Haskins stood with her arms crossed, her thin lips pressed into a flat line of disapproval. Haskins was a woman in her 50s who worshipped at the altar of the policy and procedure manual. In her eyes, compassion was a variable that complicated workflow. Inside the small, cluttered office, Haskins didn't mince words. "I saw you with the palpitations in Bay 4. You spent 12 minutes with him. 12. You held his hand, for crying out loud. We're not here to be therapists, Vance. Triage, treat, and turf. That's the job. Your patient turnover time is the lowest on the floor." Ellie met her gaze, a familiar flicker of frustration rising in her chest. "He was terrified, Brenda. A little reassurance keeps the heart rate down and prevents them from needing a sedative." "A sedative is faster," Haskins snapped. "Remember that." She made a note on a clipboard, a demerit that would go into Ellie's file. Ellie just nodded, the fight not worth the energy. She needed this job. She needed the overtime. Her younger brother Alex was a sophomore at a state university 300 miles away, and the tuition payments were a relentless tide she had to stay ahead of. So, she swallowed her pride, gave a clipped, "Yes, Brenda," and walked back into the fray, the injustice a small, hard knot in her stomach. Section 1.2, The Catalyst. At 2:17 a.m., the fragile order of the ER was not just disrupted, it was obliterated. The main entrance doors didn't hiss open, they were thrown open, crashing against their stoppers with a sound like a gunshot. 2 men stumbled through. The first was a mountain. He was broad-shouldered and moved with a coiled, athletic grace that even injury couldn't hide. He wore plain jeans and a dark hoodie, but beneath the civilian disguise was a frame honed by a discipline far more rigorous than any gym. This was Marcus Thorne, callsign Spectre. His jaw was clenched, his face a mask of pain and exertion. One hand was clamped to his side, and a dark, crimson stain was rapidly spreading across the fabric of his hoodie. He was using his considerable strength to hold up a second man, a slighter civilian whose leg was bleeding freely from a nasty wound. The staff barely had time to register their arrival when a third figure appeared, framed in the doorway like a specter of urban violence. He was thin, wiry, his movements jerky and unpredictable. His eyes were wide, pupils dilated with a chemical cocktail of methamphetamine and pure, unadulterated rage. He held a small, black semi-automatic pistol, and it was shaking in his grip. He was a local gang enforcer, a bottom feeder whose simple mugging had just gone terribly, violently wrong. "You ain't getting away!" the gunman shrieked, his voice cracking. The ER devolved into pure pandemonium. A scream tore through the room, followed by a chorus of panicked cries. Staff scrambled for cover, diving behind desks and equipment. Patients who could move did so, a clumsy, terrified exodus toward the relative safety of the hallways. The two hospital security guards, armed with nothing but radios and a can of pepper spray, froze, their faces pale with the sudden, stark realization of how outmatched they were. Ellie was the closest. She had been on her way to check on Mr. Gable again. Now she was less than 15 feet from the epicenter of the violence. Spectre, his strength failing, was on one knee, trying to shield his injured friend who had collapsed to the floor. The gunman raised his pistol, the small black hole at the end of the barrel, looking like a portal to oblivion. He was aiming squarely at Spectre's exposed back. The police had been called. She could hear the faint, approaching wail of sirens, but they were seconds away, and seconds were an eternity. In that frozen sliver of time, Ellie Vance didn't think. She acted. Her mind, a place usually cluttered with drug dosages and patient charts, went perfectly, terrifyingly clear. A memory surfaced, crisp and vivid. Her father, a retired Army colonel, teaching her basic field first aid in their backyard. He was a hard man, but a man of principle. "In a crisis, Ellie," his voice echoed in her head, "you don't run away from the chaos. You move toward the danger to protect the innocent. That's the code." Her body moved before her conscious mind could object. With a surge of adrenaline, she grabbed the edge of a heavy, wheeled gurney and shoved it with all her might. It rolled forward, a clumsy metal shield, creating a partial barrier between the gunman and a family cowering nearby. It wasn't much, but it was something. Then, she launched herself forward. She didn't run. She dove, covering the last few feet in a desperate flying tackle aimed not at the gunman, but at the man he was about to kill. She threw herself in front of Spectre's back, her body a fragile human shield. The gunshot was deafening in the enclosed space, a sharp, percussive crack that vibrated through the floor and into her bones. For a split second, she felt nothing. Then, a sensation like being hit with a white-hot sledgehammer tore through her left shoulder. The force of the impact was immense, throwing her forward against Spectre's solid frame. Her vision swam, the harsh fluorescent lights of the ER blurring into streaks of white. The world tilted, a kaleidoscope of panicked faces and overturned equipment. The last thing she saw before the darkness took her was the gunman disappearing under a pile of security guards and the first responding police officers. The last thing she felt was Spectre's strong, uninjured arm wrapping around her waist, his other hand pressing down hard on her gushing shoulder wound, his voice a low, urgent growl in her ear. Even as he was bleeding out, his training, his instinct, was to protect the person who had just protected him. Then, there was only the sound of her own ragged breathing and the encroaching silence. Section 1.3. The Cold Awakening. Consciousness returned not as a gentle dawn, but as a throbbing, insistent pain. It was a deep, searing ache that radiated from her left shoulder down to her fingertips. Her arm felt heavy, disconnected, encased in a thick layer of bandages and a restrictive sling. The sterile smell of a private room replaced the familiar chaos of the ER. The rhythmic beep of a monitor was now tracking her vitals. The first face she saw belonged to a man in a rumpled suit who was slouched in a chair beside her bed. He had the weary, cynical eyes of someone who had seen too much and cared too little. He introduced himself as Detective Miller. There was no warmth in his voice, no gratitude in his eyes. "Miss Vance," he began, flipping open a small notepad. His voice was a monotone drone. "I need to ask you some questions. Why did you intervene in the situation downstairs?" Ellie's throat was dry. She licked her lips. He was going to shoot him." "Did you know the victim, Marcus Thorne?" Miller asked, his pen scratching against the paper. "No. I'd never seen him before." "Do you understand," the detective continued, his tone shifting from clinical to faintly accusatory, "that by shoving hospital equipment and physically inserting yourself into an active crime scene, you interfered with a law enforcement matter and potentially contaminated evidence?" The question hung in the air, thick and unbelievable. There was no, "Thank you for your bravery." No, "Are you in much pain?" Just a cold, bureaucratic recitation of her perceived failures. She had taken a bullet for a stranger, and this man was treating her like a clumsy amateur who had gotten in the way of his real work. Before she could form a reply, Miller closed his notepad. "We'll talk again when you're more lucid." He stood up and left without another word. A short while later, the door opened again. This time, it was head nurse Brenda Haskins and the hospital administrator, Mr. Gerald Davies. Davies was the opposite of Detective Miller. Where Miller was rumpled, Davies was impeccably tailored. Where Miller was blunt, Davies was slick. He wore a charcoal gray suit that probably cost more than Ellie's car, and his face was arranged in an expression of deep, professional concern that was as artificial as the silk plant in the corner of the room. He didn't ask how she was feeling. He didn't mention the bullet that had been surgically removed from her shoulder just hours ago. He pulled the visitor's chair to her bedside, the legs scraping quietly on the linoleum, and got straight to the point. "Alara," he began, his voice a smooth, modulated baritone, "we have a very serious situation here." Haskins stood behind him, her arms crossed, a silent, grim-faced enforcer. Davies continued. "While we are, of course, relieved that you are not more seriously injured, your actions in the emergency room were a gross violation of hospital protocol and employee conduct guidelines." He spoke the words as if reading from a script. He used phrases that seemed designed to strip the humanity from the event: unacceptable liability, endangering other staff and patients, unauthorized use of hospital equipment. The gurney she had used to shield a family was now a mark against her. Haskins, seeing her opening, chimed in, her voice sharp. "You are a nurse, Vance. Your job is to render aid within the established parameters of your station, not to play hero. You are not security. You are not law enforcement. Your emotional impulsiveness created a chaotic and dangerous variable." Davies nodded, reclaiming the floor. "The hospital's insurance provider and our legal department are having a field day with this. For that reason, I am placing you on unpaid administrative leave, effective immediately, pending a full investigation by the board." He paused, letting the weight of the words sink in. "Frankly," he said, the mask of fake sympathy finally slipping to reveal the cold calculus beneath, "you should be prepared for termination." He stood up, smoothing a non-existent wrinkle from his trousers. "We'll be in touch." They left. The door clicked shut, sealing her in a sudden, profound silence. The only sound was the steady, lonely beep of her own heart monitor. The physical pain in her shoulder was a wildfire, but it was nothing compared to the icy shock of betrayal that was spreading through her chest. She had followed her father's code. She had done the right thing. And in the cold, sterile world of St. Jude's Metropolitan Hospital, the right thing had made her a criminal. A single tear, hot with a rage she didn't know she possessed, escaped and traced a burning path down her cheek. 2 days later, the unpaid administrative leave felt less like a temporary measure and more like the beginning of an exile. A curt email had summoned her to the hospital's administrative wing, a part of the building she had only ever seen during her initial hiring. It was a world away from the controlled chaos of the ER. Here, the floors were carpeted, the air was scented with a faint, lemon-tinged cleaner, and the only sounds were the quiet hum of computers and the whisper of hushed, important-sounding phone calls. It was the hospital's brain, and it was about to declare her a disease. The boardroom was as sterile and impersonal as an operating theater. A long, polished mahogany table reflected the recessed ceiling lights, making the room feel cold despite the comfortable temperature. Seated at the far end of the table were the 3 arbiters of her fate: Mr. Davies, looking stern and managerial; Brenda Haskins, whose expression was a smug mask of vindication; and a third person, a woman in a severe black pantsuit, with her hair pulled back so tightly it seemed to pull at the corners of her eyes. She was introduced as Ms. Albright from the hospital's legal department. Ellie, her left arm still imprisoned in a sling, her body aching with a pain that the prescribed medication couldn't fully touch, took the single chair placed for her at the opposite end of the table. It was a deliberate arrangement, designed to make her feel isolated and small. It worked. "Thank you for coming, Alara," Davies began, without a hint of sincerity. He cleared his throat and picked up a sheet of paper, refusing to make eye contact. "We are here to formally review the incident of 2 nights ago. This is not a disciplinary hearing at this stage, but rather an investigatory meeting to ascertain the facts." It was the first of many lies. He began to read from the paper, his voice a dispassionate drone. "According to the preliminary report, you willfully disregarded established hospital protocols. Specifically, Article 7, Section B of the Employee Handbook, which states, 'Employee will not engage in activities that expose the hospital or its parent corporation to undue legal or financial risk.'" He looked up briefly. "Would you agree that your actions fall into that category?" Before Ellie could answer, Ms. Albright leaned forward, her eyes cold and reptilian. "Furthermore, Article 11, Section D is quite explicit. All physical interventions involving hostile or dangerous individuals are to be handled exclusively by trained security personnel. You are not trained security personnel, are you, Ms. Vance?" "There was no time," Ellie said, her voice hoarse. Security was frozen. "He was about to execute a man on the floor of my ER." "Your ER?" Haskins interjected, a derisive sneer on her lips. "It is the hospital's ER, Vance, and your subjective assessment of the situation is irrelevant. What is relevant are your actions, which were impulsive and reckless." Haskins then produced Ellie's file. "I've noted here a history of emotional overinvestment in patients. I myself counseled you just hours before the incident about spending an excessive amount of time with a patient, encouraging an inappropriate level of personal connection." The casual cruelty of it stole Ellie's breath. Haskins was twisting her compassion, the very core of her identity as a nurse, into a weapon to be used against her. That moment of kindness with Mr. Gable was now being presented as evidence of her instability. Ms. Albright picked up the thread. "Let me explain the potential fallout your heroism has created, Miss Vance. The assailant you interfered with is now in custody. His public defender is exploring a defense that his client felt threatened, and that your actions, specifically shoving a gurney in his direction, constituted an assault, causing him to discharge his weapon in a state of panic. It's a weak argument, but it's an argument we will now have to address in civil court." She paused, letting the absurdity sink in. "Additionally, several other patients in the ER have expressed a desire to seek damages for the emotional distress caused by the prolonged and escalated nature of the event, an escalation for which you were the primary catalyst. It was a nightmare. They were taking her selfless act and meticulously reframing it as a selfish, destructive rampage. "I was trying to save a life," Ellie whispered, the words feeling futile in the face of their coordinated assault. "Your job, Ms. Vance," Albright said, her voice dropping to an icy whisper, "is to perform the duties outlined in your employment contract. Preserving the hospital's operational and financial integrity is paramount. Your actions did the exact opposite." The verdict, as she had suspected, was a foregone conclusion. Davies informed her that the board would almost certainly vote for her termination at their meeting next week. Then came the final, brutal blow. He slid a document across the polished table towards her. It was a severance and non-disclosure agreement. "We are prepared to offer you 2 weeks' pay," Davies said, his tone suggesting this was an act of profound generosity. "In exchange, you will sign this document, which includes a formal admission of professional misconduct and a waiver of your right to any legal action against the hospital. Should you choose not to sign, we will of course be forced to contest any unemployment claim you file, and we will be unable to provide a positive reference to any future employers." Oh, it was blackmail, pure and simple, wrapped in the tidy language of a legal contract. Sign and admit you were a reckless fool. Don't sign and be blacklisted, financially ruined, with a mountain of medical debt looming. Ellie looked from Davies's impassive face to Haskins's triumphant smirk, to Albright's cold, predatory eyes. Her hand trembled with a rage so profound it made her feel sick. She pushed the document back across the table. "No," she said, her voice shaking but clear. "I'm not signing that. Section 2.2, the legal vice." The chill of the boardroom followed her home to her small, one-bedroom apartment. It was her sanctuary, a space filled with second-hand furniture, well-cared-for plants, and framed photos of her and her brother Alex smiling through the years. Now, it felt like a cage. The four walls seemed to be closing in, suffocating her with the weight of her new reality. The next afternoon, a sharp knock on the door made her jump. It was Detective Miller. He wasn't in uniform, and his presence on her doorstep felt like a violation. He claimed it was a follow-up visit, but his demeanor was that of a man delivering bad news he couldn't be bothered to care about. He sat on her worn sofa, looking out of place in his cheap suit. "The assailant, a Mr. Rico Vargas, is in custody," Miller began, getting straight to it. "He's been charged. His public defender, however, is making things complicated." He sighed, as if this was all a great inconvenience to him personally. He's sticking with the story that he was acting in self-defense against Mr. Thorne and his friend. He's claiming you assaulted his client with the gurney, which provoked him. It's nonsense, of course, but it's the kind of nonsense that ties up a prosecution in knots. He looked at her, his expression unreadable. "Here's the thing, Ms. Vance. Right now, the DA has a clean case against Vargas for the shooting of Thorne's friend. Your involvement? It just muddies the waters. If you were to press charges for your own injury, it becomes a messy he said she said situation. Vargas's lawyer will subpoena hospital records, your employment file, it gets complicated." The implication was as subtle as a punch to the gut. "What are you saying?" Ellie asked, her voice barely a whisper. "I'm saying it would be cleaner for everyone," Miller said, standing up to leave. "If we just focus on the initial altercation. You were a victim of circumstance, caught in the crossfire. Let's leave it at that. It's the simplest path to a conviction." He was asking her to erase her own role, to swallow the assault against her for the sake of administrative convenience. He handed her a card. "Just give my office a call to confirm your formal statement agrees with that version of events. And I'd advise you not to speak to the media. We don't want a circus." The system that was supposed to deliver justice was actively working to silence her, to package her trauma into a neat little box that wouldn't cause any extra paperwork. The mail that day brought a new wave of horror. The first envelope was from the hospital's billing department. It was a bill for $38,754.21, the cost of her emergency surgery, her overnight stay, the medication, everything. At the bottom, a coldly polite note explained that a preliminary review by the hospital's workers' compensation insurer had denied the claim, citing that her injury was sustained while acting outside the scope of her professional duties and in direct violation of established employee conduct guidelines. They had shot her, and now they were charging her for the bullet. The sense of isolation was absolute. She reached out to a few colleagues, nurses she considered friends. The responses were a mix of sympathy and fear. One sent a string of angry emojis but said she couldn't talk about it at work. Another offered a tepid, "thinking of you." Most didn't respond at all. Only Sarah, another ER nurse who had been on shift that night, agreed to meet. They sat in a small, anonymous coffee shop miles from the hospital. Sarah's eyes were wide with a mixture of outrage and terror. "It's insane, Ellie. They're making an example of you," she whispered, leaning over the table. Davies sent out a hospital-wide memo this morning. It was titled, "A Reminder on Intervention and Security Protocol." It didn't use your name, but it described the recent incident in detail, praising the staff who followed protocol by taking cover and waiting for security. "It was a direct slap in the face to you." Sarah wrung her hands. "People are furious, but they're also scared. Haskins is on the warpath. Anyone who even looks sympathetic gets assigned a double shift or put on the list for a performance review. If we speak up for you, we're next. I'm so sorry, Ellie. It's not right, but I have kids. A mortgage." Ellie understood. She wasn't even angry at Sarah. She was angry at the system that had so effectively beaten them all into submission, a system that valued compliance over courage and protected itself at all costs. She was utterly, completely alone. Section 2.3. Rock Bottom. The phone call to her brother was the hardest thing she'd ever had to do. She waited until she thought her voice was steady, dialing his number with a hand that shook. "Hey, El, what's up?" Alex's voice was bright and full of the easy optimism of a 19-year-old. "Hey, you," she said, trying to inject a cheerfulness she didn't feel. "Just calling to check in. How are the midterms looking?" "Brutal," he laughed. "But I'll survive. How are things at the salt mines?" Something in her forced cheer must have cracked, because his tone changed instantly. "El, Are you okay? You sound weird. And just like that, the dam broke. A sob escaped her, ragged and ugly. She told him everything. The shooting, the suspension, the meeting in the boardroom, the medical bills, the police. She poured out the whole miserable, unjust story, the words tumbling over each other in a rush of pain and fury. On the other end of the line, Alex's cheerful optimism curdled into rage. What? I'm coming home. I'll get a job. I'll defer for a semester. We'll fight these bastards. No, Ellie said, the word coming out as a choked plea. No, Alex, you can't. You have to stay in school. That's the whole point. Please, just promise me you'll stay in school. The call ended with his reluctant promise and her own crushing sense of guilt. Her one selfless act was now threatening to derail the future of the one person she was working so hard to protect. The weight of it was unbearable. Humiliation came in small, public cuts. The next day, a bright pink slip was taped to her apartment door. It was a late rent notice, its cheerful color, a mockery of its grim message. Her landlord, who had always been friendly, now looked at her with suspicion when she passed him in the hall. She walked to the local branch of her bank, a flimsy folder of her financial records in her hand, and sat down with a loan officer. She explained the situation, her voice low and steady as she asked about a personal loan to cover her rent and the initial medical payments. The officer's expression went from professionally sympathetic to coolly distant the moment she said the words unpaid leave and pending termination. Her application was denied before she even finished filling it out. She was unemployed, a bad risk. The system had no room for context, no line item for heroism. Defeated, she spent the afternoon online, applying for other nursing positions at private clinics and suburban hospitals. It was a futile gesture, and she knew it. The application forms all had the same little box. Reason for leaving previous employer? What could she write? Fired for saving a man's life? They all asked for a reference from her most recent supervisor. A call to Brenda Haskins would be a professional death sentence. That evening, the world had shrunk to the four walls of her darkened apartment. She sat on the sofa, the pink eviction notice on the coffee table next to the crisp, white envelope containing the 38-0 bill. Her shoulder throbbed, a constant, physical reminder of her transgression. She hadn't eaten. She hadn't turned on the lights. Her eyes fell on a silver-framed photograph on the bookshelf. It was her father, 20 years younger, standing proud in his army dress uniform. He was smiling, his eyes crinkling at the corners. He had lived his entire life by a code of honor, of duty, of sacrifice. He taught her that protecting others was the highest calling. She had followed that code, she had honored his teachings, and it had utterly destroyed her. She felt like a fool, a naive child who had believed in fairy tales of right and wrong in a world that ran on liability and profit margins. She was broken, buried under a mountain of debt, her career in ashes, her name tarnished. For the first time in her life, Alara Vance had no idea what to do next, and as she sat there in the dark, the silence of her apartment felt like the silence of a grave. The next day brought a gray, indifferent drizzle that matched Ellie's mood. She was camped out at a small, slightly grimy coffee shop a few blocks from her apartment, nursing a single cup of black coffee she'd bought 3 hours ago. The place offered free, spotty Wi-Fi, and she was using it to scroll through websites for legal aid societies, each one a dead end. They were all overwhelmed, underfunded, and not equipped to take on a wrongful termination case against a corporate behemoth like St. Jude's parent company. She looked defeated. Her shoulders were slumped, her hair was scraped back in a listless ponytail, and dark circles shadowed her eyes. She had become one of the city's invisible people, another soul adrift in a sea of private troubles. She was so focused on the glowing screen of her laptop that she didn't notice the vehicle pull up to the curb outside. It was a black, late-model SUV, the kind favored by federal agents and private security firms. It was meticulously clean, with tinted windows and no distinguishing features. It was a vehicle designed to be completely unnoticeable, which paradoxically made it stand out immediately. 6 men emerged. They didn't spill out like a group of friends. They disembarked with a fluid, coordinated efficiency, each man seeming to know his place without a word being spoken. They were all dressed in unremarkable civilian clothing, dark jeans, plain t-shirts or Henleys, sturdy boots. But the clothes couldn't conceal the substance of the men wearing them. They were all in superlative physical condition, with the easy, predatory grace of men who were intimately familiar with violence but had mastered the art of controlling it. They didn't just look around. They scanned. their gazes sweeping the street, the storefronts, the rooftops, processing information with an unnerving calm. Pedestrians on the sidewalk seemed to part for them subconsciously, a subtle shift in the city's human current. The man in the lead was in his late 30s, with a lean, intelligent face and eyes the color of slate. They were calm, steady eyes that seemed to take in everything and give away nothing. This was Commander Jackson Cole, callsign Rook. He held a tablet, glanced at a picture on the screen, a grainy image of Ellie's hospital ID photo, and then looked through the coffee shop window directly at her. His eyes held hers for a fraction of a second before he gave a barely perceptible nod to his men. Their entry into the coffee shop was a study in controlled infiltration. They didn't swagger or make a scene. The first man in, a broad-shouldered giant, took up a position by the door, his back to the wall. The second and third fanned out, taking separate tables that gave them clear lines of sight to the entire room. The other patrons, a student writing a paper, two women chatting, an old man reading a newspaper, fell silent, their conversations faltering. They didn't know what they were witnessing, but they sensed it was something serious. The very atmosphere in the room had shifted, charged with a new, potent gravity. Rook walked directly to Ellie's table. He moved with a quiet confidence that was more commanding than any shout. He stopped and simply stood there, waiting for her to acknowledge him. Ellie finally looked up from her laptop, her face etched with weary apprehension. She assumed he was another cop, or worse, a process server from the hospital. "Can I help you?" she asked, her voice flat. He didn't answer immediately. He looked at her, his gaze taking in the sling, the exhaustion in her eyes, the faint tremor in her hand as it rested on her mousepad. Then he spoke, and his voice was deep, steady, and devoid of any artifice. "Alara Vance?" She nodded, a knot of dread tightening in her stomach. He pulled out the chair opposite her and sat down. The movement was smooth, economical. He placed his hands on the table. They were strong, calloused hands. "My name is Jackson Cole. I'm Marcus Thorne's commanding officer." He paused, letting the name register. He then gestured with his head toward the silent figures positioned around the room. "This is his team, his family. The other SEALs, men with the quiet, dangerous stillness of coiled springs, all turned their heads to look at her. They didn't smile. They didn't speak. They each gave her a slow, deliberate nod. It wasn't a casual greeting. It was a gesture of profound, solemn respect. It was an acknowledgement. In that single synchronized movement, they communicated more gratitude and validation than she had received from her entire world in the past 72 hours. And for the first time in days, a tiny, fragile flicker of hope ignited within her. Section 3.2. The Debrief. Ellie stared at them, her mind struggling to process the scene. These men were soldiers, warriors from a world she couldn't begin to imagine, and they were sitting in her neighborhood coffee shop, looking at her like she was someone who mattered. She was still suspicious, still conditioned by the betrayals of the past few days. Rook seemed to sense her hesitation. He was preternaturally patient. He began not with questions, but with information. "First, you should know that Marcus is stable. He's awake. The doctors at the military hospital we moved him to said the first bullet did significant damage, but the second one, the one that hit you, would have struck his thoracic spine. It would have been fatal or worse. He was very clear about that when he told us what you did." The words hit her with a physical force. Fatal. She had known it was serious, but the stark finality of that word made the events of that night snap into sharp, terrifying focus. "He's been in and out of it," Rook continued, his voice even. But his first coherent conversation wasn't with the doctors or with us. It was a single phrase he kept repeating. He said your name, and then he said, "They're screwing her over." Rook leaned forward slightly. "My team and I have been in town for 12 hours. We've been gathering intelligence. We know about your suspension, Miss Vance. We know about the disciplinary hearing. We know about the severance agreement you refused to sign. We know about Miss Albright from legal, and about head nurse Haskins' testimony against you. We know about Detective Miller's recommendation that you not press charges. And we know about the $38,000 medical bill St. Jude sent you." He listed the facts of her personal catastrophe calmly, as if reading a weather report. The effect was dizzying. They knew everything. The quiet efficiency with which they had uncovered the intimate, humiliating details of her downfall was both terrifying and profoundly comforting. These men operated on a different level. "We have a code, Miss Vance," Rook said, and for the first time, a hard edge of intensity entered his voice. "It's a simple code. We don't leave our people behind. on the battlefield, or anywhere else. Ever. He looked her directly in the eye, and his gaze was unwavering. And after what you did for one of ours, you're one of our people now. That single sentence landed like a tectonic shift, rearranging the entire landscape of her despair. The isolation that had been crushing her began to crack. The institutional power of the hospital, which had seemed so monolithic and unbeatable, suddenly seemed small and petty compared to the quiet, unshakable force sitting across from her. "We're going to fix this," Rook said, the statement delivered not as a boast, but as a simple declaration of fact. "We have our own way of dealing with bullies. But to do it right, we need you to do one thing for us. We need you to tell us your side of the story. Everything. From the beginning. Don't leave out a single detail, no matter how small you think it is. We need ammunition." And so, she talked. For the next hour, in the quiet corner of the coffee shop, surrounded by silent sentinels, Ellie Vance unburdened herself. The words poured out of her in a torrent, fueled by days of suppressed fear and rage. She told them about Haskins's constant petty criticisms, about the smug look on her face in the boardroom. She described Davies's cold, corporate threats and Albright's legalistic traps. She recounted Detective Miller's dismissive tone, his oily suggestions that she just let it go for the good of the case. She told them about the pink eviction notice, the denied loan, the soul-crushing conversation with her brother. She explained her financial fears, her professional ruin, her profound sense of betrayal by a system she had dedicated her life to. Throughout her testimony, the 6 men listened in absolute, unnerving silence. They didn't nod, they didn't offer words of sympathy, they didn't interrupt. They were like stone statues, their faces impassive. But Ellie could see it in their eyes. With every injustice she recounted, their gazes hardened. The air around them grew colder, heavier. The quiet professionalism they had entered with was slowly being overlaid with a frigid, controlled fury. It was a rage far more potent and dangerous than her own, because it was disciplined, focused, and purposeful. They were absorbing her pain and converting it into fuel. When she finally fell silent, her throat raw, her story told, Rook gave a slow, deliberate nod. "Thank you, Ellie," he said, the use of her first name, a quiet signal of her acceptance into their circle. "That's all we needed. You've given us the target package." He stood up, and his men stood with him, a single, coordinated movement. "Go home. Get some rest. Don't answer your phone unless you see this number." He slid a small, blank card with a number written on it across the table. "Don't talk to anyone from the hospital. Don't talk to the police. Don't talk to anyone. We'll handle it from here." His eyes met hers one last time. "We will be in touch within 24 hours." And then they were gone. They departed as they had arrived, silently, efficiently, melting back into the city's gray anonymity. The coffee shop's normal hum of conversation slowly returned, but the space where they had been seemed to hold a residual charge. Ellie was left alone at her table, staring at the empty chair opposite her. She didn't know exactly what they were going to do, but she felt a thrilling, terrifying certainty that the war she had been losing so badly had just been taken over by a new and infinitely more powerful command. The reckoning began not with a bang, but with a whisper. At 7:00 a.m. the next morning, Brenda Haskins parked her sensible sedan in her designated spot in the St. W. Jude's employee parking garage. It was a dreary, concrete structure, mostly empty at that early hour. As she locked her car, 2 figures detached themselves from the shadows near a concrete pillar. They didn't rush her. They simply moved to block her path to the elevator. Haskins's first reaction was a jolt of fear, followed by indignation. "Can I help you?" she demanded, her hand tightening on her purse. One of the men was tall and impossibly lean, with a stillness about him that was deeply unsettling. His call sign was Ghost. He had spent years in psychological operations, and he knew that fear was a far more effective tool than overt aggression. He gave her a thin, humorless smile. "Brenda Haskins?" he asked, his voice quiet, conversational. "We just wanted to offer you some friendly, professional advice." His partner, a shorter, more compact man named Viper, stood a few feet away, arms crossed, saying nothing. His silence was more menacing than any threat. Ghost took a step closer. Perjury is a strong word, but providing false or misleading testimony during a formal corporate investigation, especially one that leads to demonstrable financial and emotional damages for an employee, well, that's a serious civil offense. It opens one up to a world of personal liability. He held up a tablet. The screen showed a list of names. We've taken the liberty of speaking to a few of your colleagues. Nurses Miller, Chen, Rodriguez, Peters, they all have a very different recollection of Ms. Vance's professional conduct. They seem to recall a pattern of exemplary work, frequently undermined by a supervisor who, and I quote one of them, seemed to have a personal vendetta. They are all willing to provide sworn affidavits to that effect. Oh, Haskins's face, already pale in the garage's gloom, lost another shade of color. But that's a civil matter, Ghost continued, his voice dropping even lower. Messy. We found something more interesting. He swiped the screen, and a new image appeared, a photograph of a handsome young man in a high school ROTC uniform. It was Haskins's son. Your son, Kevin. He has an application pending for the United States Naval Academy at Annapolis. It's a fine institution, very competitive. They place an enormous emphasis on character and integrity, not just of the applicant, but of their family as well. A person's moral fitness, you see. He let the words hang in the air. It would be a terrible shame if a formal ethics complaint, say, from the command of a decorated naval special warfare operator, were to find its way onto the admissions review board's desk. A complaint detailing how a hospital administrator's mother deliberately falsified testimony to ruin the career of a woman who saved that operator's life. They take things like honor very seriously at Annapolis. He had never raised his voice. He had never made a direct threat. He had simply laid out a series of facts, connecting the dots of her life with devastating precision. He had shown her that her actions had consequences that reached far beyond the walls of the hospital. Her face crumpled. The smug vindictiveness was gone, replaced by raw, panicked fear. Ghost gave her another thin smile. You have a choice to make, Brenda. Think carefully. He and Viper then turned and walked away, their footsteps echoing in the silent garage, leaving her trembling by her car. Miles away, in his cluttered precinct office, Detective Miller was on his third cup of bitter coffee when his desk phone rang. The caller ID was blocked. He answered with a gruff, Miller. The voice on the other end was calm, deep, and resonated with an authority that had nothing to do with a badge. It was Rook. Detective, the voice said, we need to discuss the police report you filed regarding the incident at St. Jude's Hospital. Who is this? Miller demanded. That's not important. What is important is that my associates and I have had a chance to review the security footage from the ER. Not the edited clips the hospital's legal team provided you, but the full, unedited, time-stamped raw footage from all 4 camera angles. There was a brief pause. It's very clear from that footage that Miss Alara Vance's decisive actions saved the life of a highly decorated, active-duty naval special warfare operator. It is also unequivocally clear that she was feloniously assaulted with a deadly weapon. We find it confusing that your official report minimizes her role to that of a bystander and omits the assault against her entirely. Miller started to bluster, but Rook cut him off, his voice hardening slightly. This is not a debate, Detective. This is a notification. I have taken the liberty of forwarding the full, unedited footage to a friend of mine in the FBI's Public Integrity Section and another contact at the Pentagon's Office of the Inspector General. They are both very interested in cases where the heroic actions of civilians who aid military personnel are mishandled by local law enforcement. It raises questions about procedural integrity. It raises questions about potential collusion with the hospital's civil liability strategy. A cold sweat broke out on Miller's forehead. He was a small cog in a big machine, but he knew the sound of a much, much larger machine bearing down on him. I'm sure it was just an oversight on your part, Rook's voice continued, a silken cord of menace wrapping around the polite words. You have until 5 p.m. today to file a revised and corrected report, one that accurately reflects the events as they occurred. That includes adding assault with a deadly weapon, charges on behalf of Ms. Vance against the assailant, Mr. Sans Vargas. Otherwise, I'm afraid this departmental mishandling becomes a federal matter. Have a nice day, Detective. The line went dead. Miller was left holding the receiver, the dial tone buzzing in his ear. He had been so used to being the one who applied pressure, who held all the cards. In a single 2-minute phone call, he had been checked, cornered, and utterly outmaneuvered. Section 4.2. The Boardroom Counter. Offensive. Mr. Gerald Davies was admiring the view from his top-floor office when his assistant informed him that Miss Albright had arrived. He met her in the same boardroom where they had sealed Ellie's fate. The polished mahogany table gleamed under the lights. They were there to sign the official termination paperwork and close the book on the annoying Alara Vance affair. I trust the severance agreement is ready for shredding? Davies asked, settling into his high-backed leather chair. Of course, Albright replied, opening her briefcase. Her refusal to sign works in our favor. It shows she's unwilling to be reasonable. The boardroom door opened without a knock. Rook and Hammer, the team's breacher and a man who seemed to take up more space than physics allowed, stepped inside. Hammer closed the door behind them with a quiet, definitive click. They didn't wait to be invited. They walked to the table and took 2 empty chairs directly opposite Davies and Albright. Davies' face flushed with anger. Excuse me, who are you? This is a private meeting. I'm calling security. Don't bother, Gerald. They're busy, Rook said, his use of Davies' first name an immediate and jarring assertion of dominance. We're here on behalf of Alara Vance. Let's call this her performance review, and you're the one being reviewed. He placed his tablet on the table and swiveled it to face them. The screen lit up with the St. Jude's logo, followed by a series of complex charts and graphs. Let's start with finances, Rook began, his tone that of a university lecturer. Jude's Metropolitan, as part of a larger healthcare conglomerate, receives approximately 18% of its annual operating budget through a variety of federal grants. Many of these are administered through HHS and the VA, and are specifically earmarked for emergency preparedness and community veteran services. He looked up. This funding is, of course, contingent upon maintaining a positive community and service record. A significant PR disaster, for instance, could trigger a review. He swiped the screen. A video began to play. It opened with a high-definition still from the ER security camera, freezing the exact moment Ellie threw herself in front of Spectre. The image was grainy but powerful. Then, it cut to Marcus Thorne, sitting up in a hospital bed, looking directly into the camera. His voice was weak, but firm. My name is Senior Chief Petty Officer Marcus Thorne, he said. I'm a United States Navy SEAL. 3 nights ago, I was shot. I was on the floor of an ER, and I was about to be executed. That nurse, Alara Vance, she saved my life. Period. That woman is a hero. The video then cut to a montage of the other 5 members of his team, all in their dress uniforms, medals gleaming on their chests. Each man spoke for a few seconds. They spoke of loyalty, of sacrifice, of the unwritten code that binds soldiers and the civilians who help them. The production quality was stunning, the message devastatingly effective. It wasn't just a video, it was a weapon. This video, and a full press kit, has been delivered to every major news network in this city, Rook said, his voice dropping to a near whisper. And to several national ones. They are all on standby, waiting for a single text message from me to run it as their lead story tonight. The working headline is, Local Hospital Fires Hero Nurse Who Saved Navy SEAL's Life, Then Buries Her in Medical Debt. How do you think that story will play with the Federal Grants Committee, Gerald? Or with your board of directors? Or with the wealthy philanthropists whose names are on the wings of this hospital? Davies' face was ashen. Albright was staring at the tablet as if it were a bomb. Rook wasn't finished. He swiped the screen again. This time, it showed building permits and financial projections for the new cardiac wing Davies was championing, his legacy project. We also discovered that your hospital's recent expansion project was approved based on a community impact report that contained several, shall we say, optimistic projections regarding job creation and service accessibility. Projections that might not hold up to the scrutiny of a full federal audit. The kind of audit that is often triggered by, for example, a national scandal involving the mistreatment of a hero who saved a decorated serviceman. He leaned forward, all pretense of lecturing gone. His eyes were like chips of ice. His voice was steel. Here is what is going to happen. Effective immediately, Alara Vance's termination is rescinded. You will issue a full, public apology for the misunderstanding. You will create a new annual award for civilian bravery, and it will be named the Alara Vance Commendation. She will be its first recipient. You will pay 100% of her medical bills and award her a bonus for her extraordinary service. You will promote her to a position of her choosing within the nursing command structure, with a 50% pay raise, effective immediately, and you will accept the immediate resignation of head nurse Brenda Haskins, citing professional misconduct and ethical violations. He stood up. You have until noon tomorrow to enact all of these terms. If you do not, the video airs at 6 p.m., and your life's work becomes a case study in corporate malfeasance. Davies sat frozen, his mouth slightly agape. He looked at Miss Albright, his eyes pleading for a way out. The lawyer, a woman paid to be a shark, looked utterly defeated. She slowly closed her briefcase. "Meet the terms, Mr. Davies," she said, her voice a dead, flat monotone. "Meet all of them. There is no other move to make." Section 4.3. The Ripple Effect. The surrender was total and immediate. The shockwaves spread through St. Jude's with the speed of gossip, which is to say, nearly instantaneous. By late afternoon, Brenda Haskins was seen carrying a cardboard box out to her car in the parking garage, her face a mask of shame and fury, refusing to make eye contact with the nurses she had terrorized for years. An all-staff email from Mr. Davies landed in every inbox, announcing Haskins's sudden decision to pursue other opportunities and singing the praises of the incredibly brave and selfless Alara Vance. That evening, Ellie's doorbell rang. It was Detective Miller. He stood on her doorstep, holding a manila envelope, shifting his weight from foot to foot like a schoolboy called to the principal's office. He couldn't quite meet her eyes. "Ms. Vance," he mumbled, holding out the envelope. "This is a copy of the revised police report. We've added the assault charges on your behalf. The DA's office will be in touch." He cleared his throat. "I apologize for any miscommunication we may have had earlier. What you did was admirable." He practically fled from her doorstep. Her phone began to buzz with text messages from her colleagues. The fear was gone, replaced by an outpouring of support and admiration. "We knew you were right all along," one message read. "Can't wait to have you back," said another. The institutional dam of fear had broken, and a flood of goodwill was rushing in. The power structure of the hospital, once so rigid and unassailable, had been completely upended by a quiet, unseen force acting in the name of a code that no corporate handbook could ever contain. The victory wasn't just hers. It belonged to everyone who had ever felt small and powerless in the face of a heartless system. A week later, Alara Vance walked through the automatic doors of the St. Jude's ER. It was the same space, yet everything felt different. She wasn't wearing her old, coffee-stained scrubs. She was wearing a new, crisp uniform, and her ID badge had a new title under her name: Head Nurse, Emergency Triage, Patient Advocacy. It was a position that had not existed a week ago, one that Mr. Davies had eagerly created at her request. It came with the authority to override administrative bottlenecks in the name of patient care. As she stepped onto the floor, the usual din of the ER seemed to falter. A young resident looked up, then a nurse, then another. A smattering of applause started in one corner, and it spread quickly. Soon the entire ER staff, nurses, doctors, orderlies, even one of the security guards who had been on duty that night were clapping. It wasn't a loud, raucous ovation, but a steady, heartfelt show of respect. Ellie felt a blush creep up her neck, but she didn't look away. She nodded, a genuine smile finally reaching her eyes. Her first official act was to gather the nursing staff in the break room. It was a small, cramped space, but for the first time, it felt like a room full of allies, not wary survivors. "Listen up," she said, her voice clear and steady. "There's a new policy on this floor, and it's simple: people before paperwork, compassion before compliance." She looked around the room, meeting the eyes of each nurse. "If you have a gut feeling about a patient, you follow it. If you need to spend an extra 10 minutes calming someone down, you do it. If you see a situation where our rules are getting in the way of doing the right thing, you come to me. I will have your back. Always. This is our floor, and we will run it with courage and with heart." A murmur of approval went through the room. The cloud of fear that Brenda Haskins had cultivated for years had finally dissipated, replaced by a renewed sense of purpose. Ellie wasn't just a nurse anymore. The fire of her ordeal had forged her into a leader, one who understood that true authority comes not from a title, but from the trust of your people. Section 5.2. Closing the loop. Later that day, during a rare lull, Ellie took the elevator up to the telemetry floor. Marcus Thorne was scheduled to be discharged the next morning, transferred to a naval rehab facility to complete his recovery. She found him standing by the window of his room, looking out at the city. He was out of the hospital gown, dressed in simple civilian clothes. He was still moving stiffly, but the immense strength he possessed was evident again. It was the first time they had been able to speak properly since that chaotic night. The room was quiet, the only sound the distant city traffic below. "I heard they gave you a promotion," he said, turning from the window. A small smile touched his lips. "They made me an offer I couldn't refuse," Ellie replied, a hint of irony in her voice. They stood in a comfortable silence for a moment. Then his expression grew serious. "Thank you isn't enough," he said. his voice low and raspy. It's not a big enough word for what you did. They told me you were awake and yelling at the nurses, Ellie said with a small smile. That was enough for me. He chuckled, a deep, rumbling sound. That sounds about right. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small, heavy object. It was a metal coin, about the size of a $50, with an intricate design of a skull, a trident, and an anchor. A challenge coin. My team. They're not just guys I work with. They're my brothers. We have a saying. The only easy day was yesterday. It means you always push forward. You always have your brother's back. He stepped closer and pressed the cool, heavy coin into her hand. When you got hurt for me, you became family. That's a debt we don't ever forget. He closed her fingers over the coin. If you ever need anything, and I mean anything, for the rest of your life you find someone in a military uniform, you show them that coin. They'll know who to call, they'll find us, and we will come. Ellie looked down at the coin, its weight a solid, tangible thing in her palm. It was more than a piece of metal. It was a promise. A symbol of a bond forged in blood and bravery. It was an entry key to a world of loyalty she was only just beginning to understand. Section 5.3. The Departure and the Legacy. Her shift ended long after the sun had set. The ER was humming with its usual nighttime rhythm of controlled chaos. As she pushed through the exit doors into the cool night air, she saw it parked across the street, the same black, anonymous SUV. Leaning against the driver's side door, his arms crossed, was Rook. He wasn't looking at the hospital, he was looking at her. As their eyes met, he gave her one last, slow nod. It was a gesture of respect, of closure, of a promise fulfilled. Ellie, feeling the weight of the challenge coin in her pocket, nodded back, a genuine, grateful smile on her face. He got into the SUV, and a moment later, it pulled away from the curb, merging silently into the river of headlights and disappearing into the city. She turned and looked back at the glowing sign of the emergency room. A new ambulance was pulling up, its lights flashing, its siren dying with a final yelp. Another crisis, another life hanging in the balance. She took a deep breath, the night air cool and clean in her lungs. She felt the familiar pull, the call to action that had defined her life. But this time, something inside her was different. It was stronger, clearer. My father taught me about a code of honor, she thought. The hospital tried to teach me about a code of conduct. She pushed the door open, the sounds and smells of her world washing over her. But they taught me about a code that's unwritten. It's not about rules or liability. It's about showing up. It's about having someone's back, no matter the cost. She walked forward, her step confident and purposeful, moving toward the newest patient, toward the next crisis, ready for whatever came next. She was no longer just following a code. She had become one of its keepers.